Greetings, this is Greg. One of the most interesting facts about World War I aviation is that the German fighters went from monoplanes to biplanes to triplanes, then back to biplanes, and ultimately back to monoplanes. All of this happened within about a 2.5 year period. Aviation was still in its infancy, and the designers were sort of learning as they went along. One of the things they learned was that monoplanes could be very effective, so they started to make a comeback. However, the war ended before they could have any real impact on the air war. One such monoplane was Fokker's D.Viii, which is the subject of this video. I want to fast forward through a lot of the earlier history and start with the Fokker D.7. This is often called the best fighter of the war, and when equipped with an overcompressed engine, and not all of them were, but when so equipped it was a dominant fighter, especially at higher altitudes. I have a whole video on this subject if you're interested. The D.7 was so well respected that at war's end, the armistice specifically mentioned that all D.7s had to be surrendered to the Allies. The D.8, while ultimately superior, is underappreciated because it exists in the huge shadow cast by the D.7, and because the D.8's introduction was marred by some serious issues, and once resolved, the clock ran out. The war ended before it could really prove itself. The development of this plane began when Anthony Fokker asked one of his test pilots named Coolish to fly a Fokker D-7 without its lower wing. I wish I could tell you I had pictures of this, but I don't think they exist. Apparently this worked at least well enough for Anthony Fokker to pursue the concept of a monoplane because he entered the Fokker E-5 against a number of competitors in the German fighter trials, and it came out looking pretty good. Fokker received an order for 400 of these airplanes. Note I said the Fokker E-5. The E is of course for Eindecker, meaning monoplane, and it's the fifth one in the series. The previous Fokker Eindeckers were E1s through E4s, all of which look about the same. The E3 was the most common variant, shown here. The E5 is of course also a monoplane. The D designation was normally used for biplanes. However, around the time the E5 came out, the people or person, probably some bureaucrat in Germany, decided that all fighters would have designations starting with the letter D, regardless of the number of wings. Fokker already had a D7, so the E5 was renamed the D8. The plane's most notable feature is that it's not only a monoplane, but a parasol wing monoplane, meaning the wing does not attach directly to the fuselage, as in a normal high wing configuration. It's mounted above the fuselage with struts. Why do it this way, especially when Fokker had experience with monoplanes with fuselage-mounted wings? I've never seen a documented reason for Fokker going with the parasol design, but I think we can figure it out. There is an argument out there that parasol wings are low drag due to a reduction in interference drag versus a typical fuselage-mounted wing. Interference drag is drag caused by two surfaces joining together. Typically, this means where the wings and tail surfaces attach to the fuselage. NACA tested parasol mountings against other designs and found that it made little difference. Of course, that was in 1929, so maybe Anthony Fokker thought it would give some reduction in drag. Can't really say one way or the other. One clear benefit of a parasol wing is improved visibility for the pilot. Another good reason for Fokker to go with the parasol design is simply that they had been using the same basic wing mounting system for a while on the D7, and it worked very well. It's not exactly the same, of course, but if you look at the way the top wing attaches to the fuselage on a D7, very similar to the D8. There was also a pendulum effect which added to the aircraft's stabilization, so there were at least 3 good reasons for the parasol setup that Fokker must have been considering. The fuselage construction was conventional for Fokker at the time. It's made up of welded steel, not aluminum tubing, and fabric covered. For the time it was strong and light. The tail was made the same way. The wings were made of wood. It was a 2-spar design, and the rear spar was straight and the forward spar was made from 2 pieces that joined in the center and swept back toward the tips. The wing ribs were made out of a 3-ply wood construction, meaning plywood. The entire wing was covered in plywood, including the ailerons. The wing used the then new Göttingen profile, much like what was used on the D7, but updated. This thick type of wing was much more effective than the thin wings typically in use by the Allies. I covered this extensively in my video on the D7, but the short version is that for a given amount of lift, the new Göttingen profiles had less drag than the older designs still in use on Allied airplanes and other German aircraft like the Albatros. The wing was also tapered in both planform and thickness ratio. In other words, it got thinner in 2 dimensions as it went out toward the tips. The D8 had a very streamlined profile. Its frontal area was only about 6.34 square feet, about half that of the earlier E3 Eindecker, and less than any other World War I airplane I have data for. Its total drag is quite low as well, allowing for a lot of top speed without a lot of horsepower. I suppose that brings us to the engine. The plan was to use a new 140 horsepower radial engine, but it wasn't ready in time, so they went with the Oberussel UR2. This was basically a copy of a French radial. It was a 9-cylinder, air-cooled rotary, meaning the entire engine spins on a stationary crankshaft. It only puts out 110 horsepower. Not much by 1918 standards. Many fighters of the same time period were cranking out 200 horsepower, sometimes more. However, the Fokker D.8 performed well with this relatively weak engine, not only because it was fairly aerodynamic at the time, but also because it was lightweight. It only weighs 1,238 pounds loaded. That's over 100 pounds less than a Fokker E3 Eindecker, 244 pounds less than a Sopwith Camel, and 874 pounds less than a Fokker D7. The Fokker D8 was the lightest fighter of the late war, one of the lightest fighters of the war period. So how did it perform? As with many World War I airplanes, solid data is a bit lacking. Most books put the plane's maximum speed at 128 miles per hour. That's probably correct, and that makes it one of the faster fighters of World War II. Not quite as fast as a SPAD-13 or an SE-5A. Those could break 130 miles per hour, but the Fokker D8 was faster than most. Climb rate for a fighter plane is very important. It allows the fighter to intercept enemies and gain advantage in a dogfight. The D8's climb performance was fantastic. This chart is from a NASA book, Quest for Performance. I shaded the D8's line in red for clarity. The D8 outclimbs every other plane on the chart, except for the DR1. The DR1 outclimbs it when below 14,000 feet. The D8 is overall slightly better here than the Fokker D7. The D8's maneuverability is hard to quantify. The plane's wing loading is high by World War I standards because its one wing, while big, isn't twice the size of a typical biplane wing at the time. However, that one wing was of generally superior design. A plane's stall speed is a very important number in determining turn performance. Lower is better. I can't find the D8 stall speed in any type of period report, and the numbers I do see published in later books usually say they're estimates, and they range wildly from about 32 miles per hour to about 57 miles per hour. I do think the Fokker D8 had a low stall speed relative to other fighters of the time. Yes, the plane had a high wing loading, but it's an effective wing design, much more so than other wings of the period in use on fighters, and it's mounted in such a way that the fuselage doesn't interfere with it. I think the plane's stall speed was about 42 miles per hour or about 68 kilometers per hour, which would be as low or lower than nearly any Allied fighter in use at the time. I know what you're thinking. Greg, how are you coming up with the D8 stall speed when you just said there's no data from the period on this? Well, I came up with a plan. That wing design was so good that Fokker used it for years. They just scaled it up to use on their post-war commercial airplanes. One such airplane is the Fokker Universal. This is a 4-passenger single-engine airplane. It's not a parasol wing, but in most respects, this thing is very much just a scaled-up Fokker D8. It has a slightly higher wing loading than the D8, 12.1 pounds per square foot versus 10.8. We have some solid data from NACA on the Fokker Universal. This page from a NACA report puts the landing speed of the Universal at 48 miles per hour. The landing speed has to be at the very least 10% above the stalling speed, putting the stall speed for the Universal down at about 44 miles per hour. And remember, the D8 has lower wing loading. If we correct for that, which we can easily do because stall speed varies by the square root of the load factor, and we get 42 miles per hour for a Fokker Universal lightened up to be at a D8's wing loading. By the way, the fact that the D8 design was scaled up and used successfully in the 1920s is very telling. Nobody was scaling up Sopwith Camels and making airliners out of them. The D8 was unique in this respect. Back to performance, assuming I'm right about the stall speed and that the top speed and climb rate data we have are accurate, then it's a certainty that the D8 had very good sustained turn performance. The D8 likely had a good roll rate as well because of its radical, for the time, tapered wing, plus its ailerons were plywood covered, not fabric, and the plane only had roll resistance from a single wing. All of this together makes the D8 an exceptional dogfighter. So what went wrong? Why is the D7 so much more famous, and why is the D7 the feared fighter that was specifically mentioned in the armistice? First of all, as good as the D8's performance was, it was not significantly better than the D7's. The two planes are extremely close in performance, and the D7 was in service long enough to develop a very impressive combat record. The D8 just doesn't stand out when it's within the D7 shadow. The main advantage the D8 had over the D7 was a big one, but not one that's all that exciting to talk about. It appears that the D.8 used fewer man-hours and less material in its construction than any other World War I fighter. I don't have data from the period that says that, but just looking at the plane, I think it's clear. I'll also add there's a small outfit in Germany that has built at least 3 of these airplanes. They are reproductions, not just lookalikes. The builder published an incredible 2-part book documenting the project, and it's probably the best Fokker D.8 reference document in existence. The builder has also built other World War I airplanes, has access to a lot of the original documents, and says in the book exactly what I just said. The D.8 used fewer man-hours and materials in construction than any other World War I fighter. The genius of the D.8 was not in its performance. Its performance was great, but it was also very economical to build and fly. So what went wrong? Well, that's a huge part of this story. No talk about the D.8 would be complete without discussing the plane's structural failures. After the first 20 of these planes were delivered, there were 3 wing failures in a short period of time. These failures killed pilots and, of course, tarnished the plane's reputation and delayed its deployment to frontline squadrons in any meaningful numbers. There are 2 distinctly different stories about the cause of these structural failures. In Anthony Folker's autobiography, he says that the technical department of the German Air Force required him to strengthen the rear spar. Apparently, they were operating with an understanding of conventional, for the time, strut and wire-braced wings, but the D-8's wing was built differently and attached differently. The strengthening of the rear spar changed the axis upon which the wing twists, which caused the stresses to be put into different parts of the wing, causing it to fail. Once the spar was put back to its original design, the wing was able to flex as designed, and the problem was solved. The other version of the story is quite different. I'm summarizing here. If you want all the details, or if you just want to learn more about the D-8, this is the book to get. A lack of quality control, not only at Fokker, but at subcontracting piano makers who were building the wings or wing components, caused the issues. According to this book, quality control was so bad that the plywood skin wasn't properly joined to the wing ribs. Some nails missed the ribs entirely, and the glue used was dissolving when in contact with moisture. So much moisture was getting inside the wings that when holes were drilled in them, water would come gushing out. The wings were not varnished properly to protect from moisture, and some key components were undersized and significantly smaller than the design specs, which had originally passed the required tests. I think this explanation is correct, and the book has the original German documents to back it up. I think if we just take a step back for a moment and look at the motivations involved, we can discern the truth here. Anthony Fokker had his reputation to protect. Post-war, he continued to build aircraft, and at one point, his company was the biggest aircraft manufacturer in the world. He certainly had motivation to offer an explanation that projected the fault onto someone else. On a related note, Fokker used to put people on the wings of his planes to show how strong they were. The problem, as I see it, is that in flight the wing is usually taking stress in the opposite direction. Of course, they tested for stress in that direction too, but those pictures are not as dramatic as this one. Here's the same sort of picture with a D-8. That's actually Anthony Fokker himself there in the white shirt. I count 25 people on the wing. The average weight of a man in 1918 was about 141 pounds, which gave a total weight of 3,525 pounds. The D-8 weighs about 1,200, so this is about equal to 3 negative Gs. Not bad, but it's not amazing. This is just a publicity stunt, but it's a really good one. On the other hand, the Fokker Nuts team, who built 3 of these airplanes and wrote the pair of books I mentioned, have researched this extensively and have the documents and pictures to back up their explanation. Let's not forget they have also 100% bet their lives on getting this right. The sad truth is, Fokker took shortcuts near the end of the war. Some of these shortcuts involved not investing in factory equipment to build airplanes. Considering that he probably knew that after the war he would have to leave Germany, it makes sense that he did not want to invest in proper equipment and facilities. So instead, he relied more heavily on subcontracted labor to do the work, which made quality control very difficult or impossible. After the war, the reputation of the D-8 was so tarnished by the wing failures that nobody wanted to fly these things, plus most were destroyed in accordance with the armistice. The plane's combat record is also close to non-existent. There are some mentions in Allied combat reports of pilots seeing a German monoplane, which almost had to be a D-8. If you do an internet search, you might see claims that the last air-to-air victory of World War I was scored by a D-8. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not even 100% sure a D-8 ever shot down an Allied airplane in the First World War. It probably did, but records of that time are scarce. All this makes what I'm about to say sound dubious at first. I think the Fokker D.8 was the best and most important fighter of World War I. I know that's a big statement. After all, I've established that I think that the D.8's performance was only about equal or a little bit better than the D.7's, and the D.7 was rock solid, reliable, and has a very successful combat record. Well, first of all, that performance comparison is based on the D.8 being hamstrung by a 110 horsepower engine. It still has performance on par with the D7 with that engine, but it was designed for a 140 horse engine, and with 140 horsepower, the D8's performance would have been far better. Still, the 110 horsepower engine in the D8 was fine. What makes the D8 the better fighter is that you could build a lot more of them. The D7, and specifically the D7 with the BMW 3A engine that gave the plane its legendary performance, was a very expensive airplane to make. The D8's performance was just as good, but in a far more economical package. In my view, that makes the D8 better. I don't see any other way to look at it. The problems with the D8's wing had nothing to do with the design of the airplane. The main reason I think the D8 was the more important airplane was because of its impact post-war. As I said, the plane was basically scaled up and turned into a successful airliner. In fact, a lot of the later Fokkers used scale-up versions of the D8's wing, and those Fokker airliners had a large effect on the early days of commercial aviation. Additionally, the idea of a lightweight, inexpensive fighter like the D8 really took hold in later years. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was built with this same philosophy. It was inexpensive and relatively easy to build, which was its main advantage over other types. That basic concept carried on into the Cold War. The F-16 was built as a low-cost, lightweight fighter. I know it's hard to think of the F-16 as low cost, but in the 1980s, the per-plane price tag of the F-16 was half to one-fourth that of an F-15 of the same time period, depending on exactly which versions and whose numbers you're looking at. The D-8 also, more than any other plane, shows the advancements in airframes during the First World War. With only 110 horsepower, the D-8 had the performance of 180 and even 200 horsepower airplanes. There was nothing really high-tech in the airframe in terms of materials. It was just a big leap forward in design, and that leap forward helped give aviation a big push in the post-war environment. Of course, a lot of planes in World War I represented a step forward, but none in the way the D-8 did. For example, sure, the original Fokker Eindecker was a big deal, but only because of the synchronizer for the machine gun, which could have been mounted on just about any airplane, and in fact was mounted on many types. The E3 Eindecker in no way represented the future of airframe development, except possibly in that it was a monoplane, but there were many monoplanes. The Sopwith Camel was a great fighter in its time, but a dead-end design. It had no meaningful effect on post-war aviation. After the war, Anthony Fokker moved to the United States and became a U.S. citizen in the 1920s. He set up a division of Fokker in the U.S. Initially, the company was just a subsidiary and a sales outlet, but turned into a full-fledged aircraft manufacturer. It went through several stages and several names: Fokker American, Atlantic Fokker, and the Atlantic Aircraft Corporation. All of these were really Fokker and run by Anthony Fokker himself. Fokker became the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. The U.S. operation was eventually bought by General Motors and essentially became North American Aviation, and they retained Anthony Fokker as the chief designer. It's actually a very complicated story. That's the short version. I do have an entire video about this if you're interested. Fokker brought to North American a huge amount of aircraft design and manufacturing experience. In fact, Edgar Schmood, the designer of the famous P-51 Mustang, came from Fokker. So did Richard Thace, who became the foreman of sheet metal and subassembly at North American. The precise sheet metal work was a key contributor to the P-51 Mustang's performance. In fact, the first P-51 test pilot also worked for Anthony Fokker. The Fokker factory in the U.S. had very strict rules regarding cleanliness and precision. This page is from the book Mustang Designer, which touches on this subject. I think it's likely Fokker's experience with the quality control issues in Germany with the D8 led to the high quality standards at Fokker in the United States, which carried over into North American, which is why the author of this book felt it was important to mention. Not only did the Fokker D8 really pioneer the lightweight fighter concept, the design itself led directly to North American aviation, without which I think aviation history would look very different today. For that reason, I have to consider the Fokker D8 the most important fighter of the First World War.